Hello, welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I am the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm pleased to introduce tonight's Hammer Forum on Bridging the Inequality Gap with Chuck Collins and Sylvia Allegretto, and moderated by Ian Masters. Now, on to tonight's program. The Hammer Forum is a series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of Andy and Branya Galef. Tonight's forum is about what's driving American income inequality and how to bridge the widening gap. When we get to the Q&A portion of the evening, please respect our house rules, including keeping your questions to the topic at hand. Please make your questions brief and straightforward, and please direct them to our guest speakers. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ian Masters, who's going to introduce our guests. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of the Daily Briefing, Mondays through Thursdays at 5 p.m., as well as Background Briefing on Sundays at 11 a.m., all on KPFK 90.7 FM. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank all of you for coming tonight to discuss the growing gap in wealth and income inequality in America. One would think that such a discussion on a national level would have already taken place, as it did during the last Gilded Age, when in 1912, President Taft created a commission on industrial relations to look into the conditions of labor and the distribution of wealth back then, most of which was going to what the commission called the rich, the top 2%, who owned 60% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 60%, the poor, as the commission called them, owned just 5%. The Koch brothers of the day, Guggenheim, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Henry Ford, all showed up to testify, as did the head of the IWW union, Big Bill Haywood, who had been charged with murdering the governor of Idaho. The leader of the IWW, the Wobblies, excoriated American capitalists in an official government hearing that would be unthinkable today, particularly when back then there were constant violent protests and bombs were going off, with thousands turning up in New York's Union Square to mourn the deaths of 3 anarchists blown up while making a bomb meant for America's richest man, John D. Rockefeller. Let me hasten to add that I'm not in any way suggesting anyone should blow up the Koch brothers. But if you compare what was happening then to the current Gilded Age, you have to conclude that the oligarchs are getting off lightly today. And the current debate is both tepid and overdue, and is not happening in a national hearing or being aired in the mainstream media. And with unions under attack today, along with Social Security and Medicare, not to mention the Affordable Care Act, while the Koch brothers just made an extra $12 billion last year, instead of a national debate, including labor leaders and titans of industry, the only people speaking out about class warfare are hysterical hedge fund managers whining about Kristallnacht and a Nazi-like persecution being inflicted on them for being rich. Indeed, only now has the leader of the Senate, Senator Harry Reid, spoken out against billionaires buying the 2014 elections, after billions were spent buying the 2010 elections and billions more in attempting to buy the 2012 elections. Apparently, the Democrats just woke up to the reality that billions were being marshaled against them to make sure Senator Mitch McConnell becomes the leader of the Senate in November, thus freeing up Koch Industries to pollute at will and rendering Barack Obama impotent as a prematurely lame duck president. But when you look at recent history, you can take comfort in the fact that regressive and reactionary eras are usually followed by progressive eras, and it would seem we are overdue for one today. The last Gilded Age was followed by the progressive era under Teddy Roosevelt. Then we had the Roaring Twenties and the Great Gatsby excess that led to the crash and the Depression, out of which came FDR and the New Deal, and then the post-war American Dream period of social democracy from 1947 to 1977, which was followed by the Reagan era that ushered in this new age of oligarchs and a plutonomy that crashed in 2008, But instead of bailing out the little guy, as FDR did in the 30s, our government bailed out Wall Street and left Main Street to languish. So if a new progressive era is around the corner, and history would suggest so, we could do with a few muckrakers like they had back then, assuming any media companies today would hire the likes of Mark Twain and Ida Tarbell, whose exposés led to the breakup of the Standard Oil Trust. And what would also help is a little leadership. But short of that, a big discussion, which we will start tonight. Sylvia Allegretto will speak first, followed by Chuck Collins, and then we'll have a discussion, followed by extensive Q&A. Sylvia Allegretto is a labor economist and co-chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the University of California, Berkeley. She has co-authored several editions of The State of Working America, and her research interests include long-term unemployment, family budgets, teacher pay, public employee compensation, low-wage labor markets, inequality, and minimum wages. Ladies and gentlemen, Sylvia Allegretto.
Wow. This is crazy because I love PowerPoint, and I especially love a real big PowerPoint. So thank you so much. I want to thank the Hammer Museum and Forum, Darvin, who had helped me, and Claudia and Ian for asking me to come here. And it's really great to share the stage with Chuck. And it is nighttime, and I hear a lot that people really fear economists speaking because we're terrible. So I thought I'd start out. It's nighttime. I just had a Peroni, good Italian beer, down in the green room. And, really when we're talking about inequality, this is what we're talking about, right? Is the American dream alive and well for most people? Before I start, though, I have been talking a lot about in public speaking for quite a long time. I'm from a small town in northwestern Pennsylvania, Ridgeway, Pennsylvania. It's a tiny town of about 3,500 people, where my dad was a painter for over 40 years. He's a lifetime member of the Painters and Allied Trades. My mother spent her last job 24 years in a factory in the same job. Even my grandmother spent over 3 decades in a nasty carbon plant in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. But I'm really nervous tonight because it's for the first time I actually have a family member here. My cousin Gary Allegretto is here. Some of you might know Gary Allegretto. He's a great harmonica player. So I hope I can, you should look him up. He's absolutely fantastic. So I'll see what I can do knowing that Gary's here. But really, so it's not that I'm some highfalutin, PhD economist from Berkeley that really motivates me and to be so passionate. It really is my working class roots. I didn't get a PhD till I was 42 years old. I spent many years in the low-wage labor markets myself. So what I want to do, I don't use a lot of numbers. I try to use pictures to make it really kind of fun. And I want to just kind of lay the groundwork for this discussion. Because some people, I always kind of think by this time people have seen all this by now, but some of you haven't. So I just want to kind of show, what does inequality look like? What does it used to look like? What does it look like now? What are the trends in inequality? So let's just kind of get into it. And this is what people are talking about. You may have seen this. This is from my colleague at Berkeley, Emmanuel Saez, who studies this data from taxes, so U.S. tax data, right? So what it's showing, and this is a long-term trend, because this is the early 1900s, right, is that we've always had inequality. The top 1% here, they've always made quite a bit more than the bottom 90%. That's always been the case. But we see that it's gotten quite a bit worse, right, over the last few decades, I guess. And so what's really important here is to kind of parse out different time periods. So even though this pink line you can't really see, you can kind of see a little bit of a raise here. I'm gonna blow that up for you so you can kind of see what it looks like actually. So this is really important, I think, to kind of put this in some kind of historical context, right? Because this always comes up, this idea of this kind of, you have this flat, not much happening here in the early 1900s. Then you have what I call really this kind of a rising tide lifting all boats. Post-World War II period into the mid-1970s. And almost all the data we look at, whether it's wages or incomes or wealth, we kind of see this picture. And then all of a sudden something just stalls completely out, like by the mid 1970s, right? And so if you this is kind of like telling us what has happened over a long time over for the bottom 90% and the top 1%. But another way to look at this is shares, by looking at shares, right? Because this kind of stalling has made some people like very happy, right? So this is the 1%ers. This is the share of national income that goes to the top 1%, right? And so again, we're looking at the same data that I was just kind of looking at. This is when the 90% was stalled. This is when the bottom 90% saw the big increases, right? Post-World War II into the 1970s, and now we see it stalling again, right? So we see this pattern of the top 1% taking very large shares. Remember, this is right before the Great Depression, right? Over 20%, the top 1% took over 20% of all income, and we're right at that place again right now. And by the way, the top 10%, if we just went to the top 10%, they're taking 50% of all the income, right? So what is the discourse here? What we're usually told when we look at a picture like this, well, it's simply the free market. It's just the market that we have. It's the American system. It's the American way. It's unfortunate, but this is what we're dealing with, right? And I say, no, this is not some kind of free market, right? There's not some kind of free market goddess up there, right? You guys know who this is? Yeah, Ayn Rand, right? There's not some free market goddess up there pulling the puppet strings and saying, oh, let's always somehow get back to the free market, right? It's not like the physical world or gravity or something. There's no free market that just comes from on high, right? It's the market. The market we get is the market that we dictate. Now, the operative word there is who is the we, right? And so my whole premise tonight really is there is no free market and that policy matters, right? This is the same picture of the top 1% with just a few. There's many, thousands and thousands of policies, a few policies that I picked out to highlight. And these policies matter, right? I mean, here you have the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act. You had the enactment of Glass-Steagall because we were afraid that we were going to have another financial blow-up, so they were putting in policies to protect that. Again, the share of the 1% falls. They're still very rich. I mean, nobody, begrudges riches in America, right, to a point. But the broad middle class, and then we see it goes up the other way, right? So my premise really is that there is no free market, and that there's really three things here. Inequality is a function of power, powerful elites, right? And they sustain themselves through political access and politics. And then that is implemented. They implement these policies, and they sustain more wealth begets on the more wealthy and the more powerful, and it goes round and round and round, right? So we have this very vicious cycle of inequality being a function of concentrated wealth, sustained by politics, implemented by policy. That's my bottom line. Instead of this, we can't do anything about this, this is unfortunate, but this is the way it has to be. Absolutely not. That's not what has happened here. And let me just give you a quick example. Everybody knows, the falling top marginal rates. So the marginal tax rate, that's the top rate that we have. Mostly only very rich people are ever going to be, facing top marginal tax rates. So you have this long-term trend, again, from around post-World War II, all the way up to the 90% and above. And we see this long-term downward trend, right? Again, this didn't come from on high, from some free market system, right? It comes through power, politics, and policy. This is what happened here, right? And so I think this is a really interesting picture because it tells you what goes on when we have this dialogue about what we should or shouldn't do. Remember the Bush tax cuts, right? This is the Bush tax cuts right here. And so we had this huge argument that went on for a long time. Should we have the Bush tax cuts? Should we get rid of the Bush tax cut? What should we do about the Bush tax cuts, right? 39%, 35%, 39%, 35%. It was within this little frame of 39 to 35%. When I was saying, how about 39% or 40% or 49% or 59% or 69%, right? So everybody took their eyes off the really big picture and they went right down the dialogue that they wanted to have in this debate, which was right in this little round circle. That's all it was. But then, of course, even worse than this is that rich people don't really care about the marginal tax rate because they don't make their money through income, right? They make their money through capital gains. So what was going on during all of this time? A 15% capital gains rate, right? Which is why you have Warren Buffett and you have Mitt Romney paying an effective tax rate of below 15%. So again, this is just a few really stark examples of the reason we don't have a free market. These things don't just happen. They happen purposely through power, politics, and policy, right? So what was happening to workers during this time? Again, this is really important, and many of you, I'm sure, have seen this before. This is productivity, this red line. This is hourly compensation, right? That means wages and benefits. Post-World War II, lockstep. They're increasing in lockstep. Everybody's getting richer. The wealthy are certainly getting richer, but so is everyone else. This is the rising tide lifting all boats, right? And then again, what happens? Bam! You have this huge divide here, which as an economist is extremely troubling because the way that we get increases in the real standards of living is through productivity increases. We can make the widgets. Remember Econ 101, you can make the widgets faster, they can sell them for less, the company takes part of that benefit, the worker takes part of that benefit. That relationship was severed here. So what does the other side say? What do some critics say? They say, well, that's just, again, we can't do anything about that. That's globalization. That's one of the things you hear all the time. But what's globalization? Power, politics, policy. We don't have to have the trade agreements that we have. They didn't have to be, laid out exactly the way they were. We can have any type of trade agreements that we wanted to have. But we substituted the power of capitalists and ownership over workers and communities. That's what's happened here, for instance, with globalization. It doesn't have to be that way. So just real quick, like this is California, right? This is from 1979 to 2013 wage gains, because most people live on their wages, right? So this is taking, these are percentiles. So these are low wage workers, these are higher wage workers. And look over this period of time. You have to go even above the average worker to get any type of real wage gains. This means that these folks down here are making less money than their low wage counterparts did in 1979. That's unbelievable. The economy has doubled. The economic pie has doubled since then. Productivity has increased about 150% since then. Our low wage workers are doing worse. There's just no real good reason for that. But of course, it's not really incomes or wages where the action is. It's in wealth, right? And this is a great little study done by Norton and Arley. I think they're from Harvard and maybe UNC or maybe Duke. But they asked a bunch of people, what do you think the wealth inequality is? Because that's where the really action is, the wealth inequality. So imagine if you took, everybody and you split them up into 20 percentiles, and so if you had perfect wealth equality, everybody would get 20% of all the wealth, right? The bottom would get 20%, the top would get 20%. They asked the Americans, what do you think the ideal distribution is? Because Americans, we do believe that, some people should be paid more, some people are going to do better, some people are more innovative, get more education, what have you. So yeah, well, this is probably ideal. We know the top 20% is going to take more than 20%. And the bottom's going to get less, but that's probably ideal. Then they were told to estimate. What do you think it is? What do you actually think it is? This is what they thought it was, right? The top 20% taking, 60% of all wealth and everybody else sharing the rest. And then they were told what it really was, right? Okay. In PA, we call this kind of a shit show, right? We can't live on this. This isn't going to work out for everybody. So the question is, what do we do about it? Is it a problem? Some people don't agree it's a problem. Is it a problem, and what can we do about it? And so I kind of look at it this way. This is very simplistic. But we always have competing interests, right? That's what you have in a democracy. That's what you have in an economy. You have competing interests, but you hope kind of like you have a well-oiled machine, everybody's getting heard and everybody's doing better. But that's not what's happening now. I think this is kind of what everything is kind of morphed into. That we have a corporatocracy or a plutocracy, the wealthy, by design, again, these policies, this 50-year trend of deregulation, declining union density, the hollowing out of worker rights and representation, the increase in trade agreements, another one on the way, maybe even the TPP that's being secretly talked about now in the administration. So, it's been called, my buddy Dean Baker calls it NAFTA on steroids. The financialization of our markets. After 50 years of this, what do we have? We have increased inequality, just like I've shown you. And I've got to be real strong here because I really feel like a lot of people think that or are told that increase in inequality is an unfortunate side effect of our free market system. But I say that this is actually was its purpose. These policies that were implemented, this was the purpose, this was the end game, this is where we are. So I'm going to stop here, and I hope this just kind of sets a good stage for the rest of our talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Chuck Collins is a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he directs IPS's program on inequality and the common good. He is the co-author of several books, including Economic Apartheid in America, a primer on economic inequality and insecurity, The Moral Measure of the Economy, and Wealth and Our Commonwealth, which he co-wrote with Bill Gates Sr. He is the co-founder of Wealth for the Common Good, a network of business leaders, high-income households, and partners working together to promote shared prosperity and fair taxation, and the founder of the Patriotic Millionaires. His latest book is 99 to 1, How Wealth Inequality is Wrecking the World and What We Can Do About It. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Collins.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Sylvia, for giving us such a frank picture. And since we're sort of not far from the Getty Villa, I thought it would be appropriate to, this conversation about wealth, thinking about Sylvia's slide, reminded me of the question that was put to J. Paul Getty, which was, how does one become wealthy in America? And he said, it's really quite simple. There's 3 things one must do. So let me do a little poll here. First thing, get up early every morning. How many of you got up early this morning? Very good. Number 2, work hard all day. Very good. Number 3, find oil. Okay. Well, sorry, that doesn't get you the whole way. So Sylvia's, talking about the 1%. I have to say I took that personally. No, I grew up in the 1%. I don't have, I have to go pretty far to talk about my humble working class origins like Sylvia, because my great-grandfather had a butcher shop in Chicago, and his name was Oscar Mayer. And so my father used to say, bringing home the bacon has a different meaning in our family, which is true. So I actually grew up in the 1%. I grew up in a suburb of Detroit, and I went to Cranbrook School, a private boys' school, and one of the upperclassmen a few years ahead of me was this guy, Mitt Romney. And the school motto was aim high, which was depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight up into the air, which if you really think about it, pretty much tells the story. So I want to pick up from Sylvia's excellent, both the picture and her analysis of the dynamic of how, when we talk about the drivers of inequality. And the conversation, as Ian said, is nowhere near as robust as it was a century ago. There was just a fervent discourse on, people saw these extreme inequalities a century ago as potentially destroying self-governing democracy, our fragile experiment as a nation. And but the conversation has gotten better. I mean, if you think in the last couple of years, these issues of income inequality have really come to the fore. Our president calling them the most significant issue of the day, the Occupy movement. There's a new film out, I don't know if you've seen, called Inequality for All. Anybody seen the new documentary? Terrific, with Robert Reich from from Berkeley. So there's now kind of more attention and focus to it, and it's also had, I think, it's gotten a little more scrambled into the political machinery, meaning now you have, I would call them inequality deniers, like there's really, okay, all right, there's inequality, but it doesn't matter, and actually it's a good thing, you start to hear this kind of discourse. But if I were to summarize, very similar to what Sylvia did, if I were to summarize what are the drivers, why is it that these inequalities have accelerated in the last 30 years? The first thing I'd say is it's very important to take the conversation about extreme inequality and delink it from our conversation about deservedness and merit. These extreme inequalities have nothing to do with some people getting up early, working hard all day, and others not. They are rooted in distortions and political manipulations, and are really have, so people will still say, well, inequality is about reward. Yeah, some people work harder. This is completely delinked from that. These accelerating extreme inequalities, and if I were to summarize why they've happened, I would say that there's been a power shift, that the power of organized workers has declined as the power of unions and the union densities decline. The power of ordinary voters and civic organizations has declined, and the power of corporations and wealth holders has increased in our political system. And as a result of that, the rules of the economy have been tilted in favor of large asset owners and global transnational corporations at the expense of wage earners and locally rooted smaller businesses. The rules have been tilted. Trade policy, tax policy, wage policy, all down the list. As Sylvia says, it's about political choices. So I like to think of that as sort of a summary of the driver. And when people say, well, should the rules, people think, yeah, we live in a free market, but the rules that shape that market, have been tipped. Whereas in the years after World War II, the rules were focused on expanding middle class opportunity, et cetera. There was more along those lines. The other thing that I would just say is that these inequalities really matter. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, I was involved in debates where people say, I actually met with the leadership of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops a decade ago. And they said, we understand the moral problems around poverty, but should we really be concerned? Does it really matter how wealthy the wealthy are? And one of the things that's happened in, I think, the last decade, and thanks to the work of people like Sylvia, is that there's really almost like an interdisciplinary flood of research, political science and health research, showing that societies that have extreme inequalities of wealth actually are weaker in so many ways. That, as the book I wrote, how inequality is wrecking the world and what we can do about it. It is, think about everything you care about, your children and grandchildren, health, the health of our democratic society, the health of our local communities, the built environment, sports, the economy, the mobility, all these things have been undercut by these extreme inequalities. And I won't go into it in every category, but obviously democracy, when you have a situation, as Harry Reid says, the Republican Party has a coke addiction, when you have a small group of billionaires driving and displacing the power of voters. Someone said to me, the last election is the last election where, if you saw the Republican primary, the candidates that advanced each had a billionaire patron. You need to have a billionaire patron, at least a couple, to kind of be politically considered politically possible anymore. That now we're moving to the stage where the first step of your presidential campaign is to identify your billionaire. So that's a clear one. That Sylvia's graphic, the capture of our democratic system by money is a huge, it matters a great deal. Health, our public health, the more inequality exists in a community, the worse your public health indicators are. This week is the 5th anniversary of the publication of a terrific book called The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson, Kate Pickett, British epidemiologists, looking at how societies that have less inequality do better and perform much better on a whole bunch of health indicators, and communities and counties and countries that have great disparities, inequality is making us sick on a number of different levels. Social mobility. We like to think that the United States is the land of opportunity and that there's social mobility and people move up and down. But here's the bad news. Canada now has 3 times the social mobility as the United States. If you want the American dream, move to Canada. If you want the American dream, move to Scandinavia. If you're not born wealthy and you want to have real opportunity, go to a country that invests in the population, invests in early childhood education and health, and ensures that there's supports and mobility, social mobility, because the United States is no longer living up to that reputation. And finally, too much inequality undercuts the health of the economy. And just 2 weeks ago, the International Monetary Fund published a report looking at how these extreme inequalities undercut traditional measures of economic growth, let alone health and other well-being. And it's a very interesting set of arguments. But one of them is when you have stagnant wages of 90% of the population and rising living costs, people borrow to maintain a standard of living and to consume. So we have debt-based consumption. And at the very top, you have the super rich who are taking their wealth and looking for higher financial returns and moving more into the shadow speculative investment. So on both ends of the economic spectrum, you have things that foster economic instability. So too much inequality undercuts the health of the economy. So, and down the list, I could tell you my favorite about sports. How does big money wreck sports? You know, that's kind of obvious, but you know, it affects your health. It affects you and your children and your grandchildren's well-being and the opportunities they have. And these inequalities really cut very differently for people under 30 who are entering into a whole different society and economy and trajectory because these extreme inequalities have whittled away the ladders of opportunity. So let me turn to kind of what are the pressure points. I like Sylvia's image of that cycle. So where do we intervene in this cycle? And where is there organizing and movements that are trying to do that? And one thing I'll say is that for those of you who saw Inequality for All, which I think is a terrific movie, the message there was we need to sort of increase spending power of the middle class and that will drive the consumption engine and that will kind of rev up the propeller and we'll be able to have growth that will be more healthily distributed. And I sometimes think that's the movie I would have made 15 years ago. But I think we have an additional challenge, which is the ecological constraints on the old model of economic growth, right? We are now pushing up the planetary boundaries in terms of what we can do in terms of energy, dumping carbon into the atmosphere, fossil fuel generated economic growth. So whatever the interventions we're going to talk to are going to have to kind of break out of the old rule book a little bit. We're going to have to look at sort of some of the ecological limits that may affect the blueprint going forward. But there's 3 kinds of interventions, I would say, that get at that cycle of politics, concentrated wealth, plutocracy-driven policy. One are the things that raise the economic floor. So the reason why most industrialized countries have less inequality than the United States is they have a higher minimum wage. They have a floor through which people cannot fall, a decency standard of living, healthcare, minimal. If you're sick, you don't have to go to work and you won't lose your job. There's sort of a higher floor than we have in the United States. So clearly, raising the minimum wage, investing in early education, all those kind of things that raise and create standards of decency. So raise the floor. The other intervention areas I would call level the playing field. That what are the things that we can do to look at how is it that for instance, in tax policy, you have one set of rules for taxing investment from capital and another for taxing labor, or you have an offshore tax system where wealthy individuals and global corporations can move their money around the planet to avoid taxation, and businesses and individuals who are rooted here can't dodge taxes. So let's look at rule changes that do that, as well as campaign finance. We need to block the nexus between money and influence so that votes matter. So there's a set of interventions that I would call level the playing field, including trade policies, fair trade policies that don't pit workers in the United States against workers around the world in a race to the bottom. But the third category is the one that's the toughest. And we can, I think in the current political moment, we can raise the floor, we can level the playing field, but the concentrations of wealth have become so top-heavy, if you will, that that concentrated top-heavy wealth will undermine our raising the floor and level the playing field initiatives. For instance, campaign finance reform. In the current environment, I think money and influence is like water running down a hill. And you can put up barriers and say, okay, there's campaign spending limits or there's this limit on this PAC, but that money is just constantly going to be finding ways around those barriers because that is the nature of concentrated wealth in this society. So the third area I would call is address directly the concentration of wealth and power. That we need to restore the progressivity of the tax system. We need a robust inheritance tax, or what I call a estate tax. We need to think about things like a financial transaction tax that slows down the froth in the speculative market. We need to look at things like eliminating the subsidy for excessive CEO compensation, so we kind of remove some of the taxpayer incentives for very short-term outlooks. One thing is, as Ian mentioned, I work with Bill Gates' dad, Bill Gates Sr., around a campaign to keep the estate tax. And over the last decade, the estate tax has been maintained, but now it's become much more porous. So last year, billionaire Sheldon Adelson transferred about $6 billion of wealth, $7 billion of wealth to his heirs without an estate tax using a series of trusts called GRATs. So the estate tax, our one and only most progressive tax on the intergenerational transfer of wealth, is been essentially rendered porous for the most wealthy. So we need to sort of focus again on restoring the estate tax. And let me just close with a story and then look forward to your questions and discussion. But when about a dozen years ago I was coordinating this campaign to try to keep the inheritance tax, the estate tax, from being abolished, I got a call from Bill Gates Sr., and if you can imagine me sitting in a little carpet-stained office in Boston and a coworker saying, Bill Gates is on the phone, I thought, right, this is just one of my prank coworkers, probably the same coworker who would imitate George Soros on the phone and say, I'm sending you $1 million, But anyway, it was Bill Gates, the father of the founder of Microsoft, who said, I've heard you're trying to organize this campaign. You're trying to organize millionaires to step forward and say we should retain the estate tax. How can I help? I said, well, we could organize other millionaires. We could write op-eds. We could go visit members of Congress. They'd probably meet with you, Mr. Gates. He said, sure, I'll do all those things. So we came up with this call to preserve the estate tax, and I drafted the language, and Mr. Gates said, this looks good. And I said, well, I'll go out and talk to Judy Wicks and Martin Rothenberg and some of these business owners that I know. And he said, oh, I'll talk to Warren Buffett and Paul Newman and George Soros. And I said, well, okay, you work on your network and I'll work on my network. We're all about networking here. So it was, we got about 2,500 millionaires and billionaires to step up and say, don't abolish the estate tax. Retain it. It's a fair tax. And Bill Gates and I went on the road and published this book. And we came to Los Angeles, actually, like about 30 people came. But we had bigger audiences other places. I know people are busy here. So, but I remember one particular town in Maine. We were in Portland, Maine. It was freezing. He was refusing to wear a hat. I was supposed to take care of the guy. He's like, we're talking to 200 small business owners with GOP lapel pins. And they're like, these are the people who work to get rid of the estate tax, the death tax, right? These are the anti-death tax folks. And I got up and did my rap. Look, the estate tax raises money, substantial revenue from those most able to pay. It encourages philanthropy. It puts a brake on the buildup of concentrated wealth. I sort of made my argument. And then Bill Gates got up and said, listen, if you have 10 million or 50 million or $50 billion. And then he'd sort of say, I only know one person who has that much wealth, my son. If you have that much wealth, you probably worked hard, you probably got up early in the morning, but you didn't do it alone. Your wealth in some part comes in part because you operate and do business in this country. And of course, he's talking to a group of business owners. And he says, think about the infrastructure, the property rights protections that you enjoy as a business owner, the investments that make so much of our activity possible. If you have 10, 50 million, 100 million, you owe society back for the opportunities that you've enjoyed. And the estate tax you want to lead to the gallows, is an opportunity recycling program. It is a way in which when you come to the end of your life and you've accumulated a substantial amount of wealth, more wealth than you or your children will really need to have a good life, that society has a claim on that. And you should put it back and invest in the society so that those who are not born wealthy can have the same opportunity. And I think that is the message here, that going back, that myth of deservedness is kind of what holds this inequality in place. The story that you have when you lean over the fence post and talk to people about inequality, what we have in our minds is the narrative of deservedness. You are where you are because of your effort and work. And we need to sort of, if we're going to address the deep cultural root causes of these inequalities, we need to create and develop different stories that tell the real truth about how wealth is created in cooperation with a society and how society has a legitimate claim on that wealth. So let me stop there for our discussion. Thank you.
So let me start with you, Chuck, because you in your talk you mentioned the limits of growth in terms of global capitalism because of its impact on the planet and global warming, and that would suggest a requirement for a new kind of patriotism, a global patriotism, because we all share this earth and we all share the common threat that the earth has, except we're not there yet, obviously. So let's talk about American patriotism, because you founded the Patriotic Millionaires. Patriotism would suggest to me that it means that there's a social contract, that we're all in it together. What was your sense when you took the Patriotic Millionaires to the Hill of whether there is this concept of that we're all in it together and an implied social contract, that there's something valuable about being an American?
I think it's there. I think that the folks that step forward, and that's many, many more than, the good news is there's many, many more people in that group than we sometimes think, who basically understand that their good fortune, understand that they have a responsibility, a desire, an obligation to give back, pay back to the society. And that was a simple message when the Patriotic Millionaires went. It was around the sort of the repeal of the Bush tax cuts, and I agree with Sylvia. You'd think the sky was going to fall in that debate. You think that this was going to be the end of Western civilization, and we had our Patriotic Millionaires saying, it's really going to be okay. You can raise my tax rates 4%, and life will go on. But they really were trying to get to that larger point, that what kind of society do we want to live in? Do we want to, think the future of these inequality trends is very scary. Thomas Piketty has a new book coming out, a colleague of ours, called Capital in the 21st Century. And it starts to peel back the picture of where we're going. If even these trends, the accelerating inequalities, only grow at half the rate they have the last 30 years, we're looking at Blade Runner, future here. And put that together with an ecological crisis, and you see the wealthy withdrawing into enclaves and fortresses of wealth, a kind of Brazilianization of U.S. society. So I think there are people who understand that is in no one's interest. These extreme inequalities are bad for everybody, including the very wealthy. It undermines the social contract. It undermines the quality of life. And on the ecological point, there's people who understand that the wealthiest folks in this country are also the biggest carbon users, carbon dumpers, if you will, and
I
that
mean the Gulfstream jets.
the private jets and the whatever, the Hummers and the even people who claim to be ecologically concerned are using huge amounts of energy, and that we have a responsibility in the United States and particularly at the top to power down so the rest of humanity has a fighting shot.
And Sylvia, when you do your slideshow and talk to audiences around the country, and Chuck mentioned this, Canada and Scandinavia, where there's more opportunity and more social mobility. The question that I often want to have asked is that, what is our birthright in this country? In other words, if you're born in Sweden or in Canada, you grow up with free healthcare, childcare, pregnancy leave, guaranteed pension. That's a birthright. I mean, what little we have seems to be constantly under threat, and I don't know whether that is a part of the American character. It's certainly not a part of the American dream.
Yeah, I guess, well, you hear, like, we just like to say we're Americans, we're number one, whether it's true or not. I mean, when I give these talks, people, Chuck brought up the fact, and I have a slide for everything, but I have a slide that says, that shows all the countries that have more mobility than we do, Canada being one of them, and they're obviously sometimes shocked. I know on my blog posts I get some really kind of ugly mail at times, because this idea of patriotism, what you're talking about, it's now wound up in this kind of free market ideal, right? You have the meritocracy, that we think everybody gets what they deserve, when clearly, even with your example, do you get up early, do you work hard, that everybody somehow gets what they deserve in this natural extension of the free market. It's simply not true, but a lot of working class people themselves want to believe in this. I think it's why, you have a lot of people who would benefit from, for instance, which all these countries have, which are high unionization rates, right? And they also have high worker protection, the right to organize. They have other worker protections such as paid sick leave and maternity care and vacations. We're the only advanced economy in the world that don't have mandated vacations. Of course, when you put that against the fact that we don't even have sick days, that's not,
But Cadillac just put out an ad on the Academy Awards celebrating the fact that we don't get 6 weeks vacation like those Europeans. We work hard. I mean,
yeah.
Quick poll here: who would like 6 weeks vacation? Maybe they didn't ask you. I don't know. Okay.
Yeah, and of course that's coming from somebody who has the choice. The guy in that ad's a very wealthy person, right? So he has the choice of either, to continue to work or to take vacations. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, most Americans don't. So we're at will. Workers in the U.S. are at will. You can be pretty much hired and fired for almost anything. Which amazes people in Europe, right? They can't believe. It seems it's barbaric to most of the rest of the world, the way we have this system, that we have to have it very flexible for it to kind of work, right? And this is where all this inequality comes from. A lot of the turning of the tide of that smiley face back up so high for the 1% is because in the 70s, with all the stagnation and stuff, we were saying, Americans have there's too much unionization here. Our markets are too highly regulated. We need more flexible markets. And of course, flexibility means deregulation, decline in union strength, union density, and all that, right? Free trade agreements expose our workers to, child labor and even slave labor around the world and think we're going to compete. So people just I don't think people get the whole story, because a lot of well-meaning folks, like where I come from, I spent a lot of times in bars back at home arguing, with people who I think like just a couple generations ago when my dad was young. My dad and wasn't educated. Went to high school, but he knew right away that he had to have a union job to make it. He had 5 kids. We did all right. We were certainly never rich, but he now lives in a decent retirement with just a modest pension. He knew that he needed a union. He needed some voice, or he was not going to do well in life. And a lot of people now who aren't getting that message. I think they're getting it more and more because, coming out of this Gilded Age we're talking about, coming out of the Great Recession, the most recent research from Emmanuel Saez from Berkeley, who I used a lot of his data here, has shown that 95% of all the gains since the economy started growing again post-Great Recession, 95% of those gains have gone to the top 1%. And when you have unemployment rates, like here in California, they're well over 8%, in the US, just below 7%, we're 6 years into this mess. When you have labor markets that are so loose for so long with unemployment rate, workers have no voice. They had very little voice even when we do have tight labor markets. Tight labor markets would help a lot, but certainly 6 years into this, the damage is just cumulative and hard to imagine if you can actually put some kind of a measure on it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that when you talk about the meritocracy, when you talk about the patriotism, the powers that be want to tell you that you're some kind of, you're called names, right? Mm-hmm. When you bring this stuff up, you're called names. And so the more we talk about it, the more you get the information out there, the more Americans will realize what is the truth, right? We can't stay in this kind of myth of what the American dream was or is or should be, but what is happening on the ground today?
Well, I thought one of the most telling things was that slide you shows how productivity and household income tracked together up until the mid-1970s and then diverge with productivity going up like crazy and household income flatlining. And that clearly indicates that the beneficiaries of the globalization in the modern economy is capital, not labor. And that point of the mid-70s is a key point. And my understanding is what happened then, beginning with Reagan and his Federal Reserve chief who came in 87, Alan Greenspan, was that rather than keep wages and incomes and cost of living adjusted and continuing to rise as they had up until the mid-70s, they made credit incredibly available. Where the banks get the money for, now they get it for almost 0% and lend it out at 25% or whatever. And that has given the American people the illusion that they've maintained their standard of living. And with all illusions, they're going to crash. I mean, at what point can you sustain that graph?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, that in some ways, these inequality trends that we've been living through have been masked by people borrowing and more people working more jobs or more members of the household entering into the workforce. So 70s and 80s and up to the present, you have, and then 2008, things seized up when you could no longer borrow to maintain your standard of living and consume, and people start to lose their jobs. But I think that that period in the mid-70s was that break with the social contract that you're talking about. It was so, for instance, if the minimum wage had kept up with worker productivity, if worker productivity gains were reflected in the rise of the minimum wage, if it rose at the same rate, it would be like $18 today. If it had kept up been worth the same amount in 1968, it would be, $12 today. So that's an example of the rule. There were policy decisions to keep the minimum wage depressed and keep wages down. So along with
and make credit easily available,
and then make access to credit available. So you had this situation where people borrowed to maintain their standard of living, worked more hours, and that masked the real deep stagnation in real wages.
And Sylvia, do you see that as being unsustainable and at a certain point crashing?
I would have thought that. I came out of school 10 years ago and worked for the Economic Policy Institute in D.C. They have been sounding the alarm on this for over 25 years. They were worried about this over 25 years ago. So I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to turn around anytime soon. But the minimum wage is, it's something that I write a lot on, and I do a lot of my academic research on the minimum wage. It's like the Bush tax cut narrative that's in this really small confine. I mean, the minimum wage, again, we're talking about going to $10 an hour. federally. And what a low bar. What we're saying is that even though the economy has more than doubled over this period of time, even though the workers, and as you saw, are some of the most productive workers in the world, we somehow have to get our lowest wage workers back to what the low wage workers were making in the 1960s. It's kind of like the 35-39, right? Everybody should be doing much better. I read some writings that were written quite a while ago. I forget one, but they were talking about like the 30-hour work week, right? So it was it was written decades ago. And they were saying with the productivity that we have and all the wealth that we're generating in this country, we'll have, people will be working much less. But of course that it certainly has not happened. As Chuck said, it's not that people are working a whole lot more, it's that we have a lot more workers, because it has been completely masked by the influx, especially of women into the labor force in the 70s and 80s. Family work hours exploded, right? One thing that people are surprised about when I give these type of talks is when you show them that this is not new. This didn't just happen because of the Great Recession. These trends have been well in the making for 30 to 40 years now, and things are just getting much worse, and they blew up because the things that were masking, the credit, the easy credit, more people working in the family, so keeping family incomes, not because men's wages were increasing, they were actually falling, but women coming into the labor force kept the family income. Well, that can only go on so much. You can only work so much. And so basically all this kind of came to a head in the Great Recession, and it all blew up, and then you kind of try to say, like, all these problems that we have that came to the forefront with the great protests of the 99 and the 1%, which I thought were great, and I think that we're having these kind of discussions because of that springboard, is because this stuff has been in the works for a very long time. This isn't just a small problem that happened when the housing bubble blew up. There's all those decades of policies that were put into place that made that happen. And quite frankly, not a whole lot has changed since then. So it's hard to know where we're moving into the future, when I'm really worried now when you see the increase in the Dow, when you have these boom and the IT boom and the bust, the housing boom and the bust, and now we're booming again. But somehow this is the real economy. It's a little bit hard to put much faith in that.
Let's take questions. We have microphones, I believe, on both sides. And this gentleman here.
Thank you. I have a question that relates to both of your comments. In regard to the cycle that Sylvia was talking about, I'm going to reframe it slightly. So we have a policy grab that leads to a power grab that leads to a money grab. And then we had, as Chuck, I think you said it was $18 an hour if we went there. Multiply it by 2,000 hours, multiply it by 2 people, you get $72,000 per 2 parents, minimum wage, right? So 2,500 millionaires and billionaires got together around one policy issue. What are the chances of those same folks and others of like mind getting around the issues of climate change, TPP, and minimum wage?
Well, I think that's a great math illustration of the consequences of policy, the shift in wealth. And, the good news, I think that, one of the things that was underlying the Occupy movement was people feeling trapped in poverty, the collapsing middle class experience. I mean, we've had, the home ownership rate is declining in the United States. Debt levels are rising again. The people who's have had the dream that, I'm going to retire, I'm going to be able to pass something on to my children, dreams deferred, destroyed. So there's a constituency there. And then there's this incredible constituency of people under 30 who are beginning to understand the story and how that's, how the rules are tilted against them, and that they're not going to have the opportunities that maybe their parents had or whatever. And that's a very potent political constituency, I think. And that's where I would say those are the constituencies for a political realignment. You would have thought we would have had it in 2008 with the economic bubble, but the populist moment was in some ways captured by the sort of the Tea Party right. But I think that the underlying conditions that led to the Occupy movement haven't gone away. They're waiting, they're there. And I think that the fact that 70% of the population supports raising the minimum wage and going way beyond the incrementalist proposal that's there shows that constituency understands, like, this was taken from us. So I think it's just a matter of time. I think there is a realignment. I understand the despair of watching a political system captured by powerful corporate interests, but I also see it's very vulnerable, that a year from now we could be having a very different national conversation coming out of these inequality conditions. So I look for and the fact that people feel like the minimum wage movement is blocked at the national level, and so it's moved to the states. The carbon tax, the movement, I think there's a robust inheritance tax, but a carbon tax, again, it's blocked at the national level. California, Massachusetts, where I live, there's campaigns to sort of bring that a revenue neutral carbon tax. There's a few like pressure points like that could really kind of realign the body politic, to use a acupressure. I'm in California, right? So I can say that, there are things that could shift things much quicker than we think. So all the ingredients are there.
But
just need the match.
I would just want to add to that, though, but that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. We're supposed to be a representative government. We have over 70% of people in the U.S., even a majority, it's about 80-some% of Democrats and a majority, about 55% of Republicans want a raise in the federal minimum wage. Who are they representing? Why isn't it being done? It's because the powerful are not the 70% of Americans who want a raise in the minimum wage, because it would just be done, right? Why isn't it done? Whose bidding are they doing there? Not ours. I mean, it's a real indictment of what's going on, because the fact, I'm glad that it's done at the state levels. I like having higher state minimum wages, because I think that addresses the issue of cost of living differences and such. But I still believe that a federal minimum wage to let nobody behind a certain bottom, a certain wage is the best way to go. But I just think that's a perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about. Doesn't get done.
Hi. So I'm 28, and there's not that many people in here that are my age.
Sorry about that.
So my question
Glad you are
is-
here.
Yeah. So my question is, it seems to be that maybe the rate of educating the American people isn't happening at the same rate as the concentration of wealth, and so the wealth is concentrating at the top faster than people are being educated about the solution. And I wonder if there's anything that we can do to catalyze, or what it might take to catalyze that education, so that I don't have to wait 15 or 20 years until my generation is in like voting abundance to see change happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I think that I think this is the kind of thing that lends itself to teach-ins, campus teach-ins, community teach-ins. There are younger people starting to organize. There's a group emerging called Future Speak, which is people under 30 who want to look at these inequality issues and engage on some of these policy issues. But you could start your own local version of that, convene, things start with small groups, identify a half dozen other people who really want to make this an issue, and, form a support group to push that out. This film Inequality for All, for the limitations I said about it, I think is a fabulous film that sort of helps tell the story that in some ways Sylvia also told. So pushing that conversation out. In the same way the climate change movement has been doing teach-ins and campaigns around divesting from fossil fuel, and kind of that's much more alive now on campuses and for people under 30. But I think, do what people have done in social movements through the last 100 years. Reach out and organize others and have those conversations. I think it's ripe. It's right there.
Give my PowerPoint yourself. Do this at home. I'll give you my PowerPoint. Email me. Anybody who wants it, I put these together. I spent a lot of time on them. Anybody who wants it to show their friends, their Republican brother-in-laws, anybody who wants it, I put notes on them so you can go do this yourself, and they have fancy TV now. Do your own PowerPoint at home. I'll provide it.
But I think there is an important way to tell people who are over 35, who are in the top 60%, their experience of these inequalities was really different than for people younger. And there's a woman actually named Heather McGee, who's now the new head of an organization called Demos, who has a great video talking about the generational impact of inequality. And they have so Demos is a resource on the generational impact of these inequalities. What does it mean? What does it mean that so many young people graduating college with huge amounts of debt into a workforce where there aren't the sort of jobs that, it's not your parents' it's not your parents' workforce.
Okay, Sylvia, I was wondering how you felt about a universal basic income and that sort of thing, and if that's an idea you think is viable as far as addressing poverty and income inequality.
I don't think that's probably viable here. Again, we just, they're talking about that. Where is it? Australia or somewhere they're talking about that. I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, I think that we probably can't get there, but we can get a higher minimum wage and such. The issue of poverty, for instance, we've shown some recent work that my colleague Aaron Dubé has done, showing that increasing the minimum wage, which seems to really take people by, shock people, the increase in the minimum wage actually pulls some people out of poverty. It doesn't pull everybody out of poverty because most people in poverty don't work. So we need other policies. So it's not all labor policy that is going to tackle all of our problems. The issue of poverty it's really kind of crazy when you think about it. For 50 years, the poverty rate in the U.S., now first of all, it came down dramatically, due to basically Social Security, right? We had massively high poverty rates for retirees and older folks. That's why they instituted Social Security. The poverty rates plummeted for the elderly. But over the last 50 years, we've made no inroads in poverty. Poverty, basically, our official poverty rate, fluctuates based on the business cycle between 11 and 15%. That's it. We've never gone below that, 11%. We're at 15% right now. It's basically flatlined for a half a century. That's a different issue. And of course, that has a lot to do with the fact that we're, starving the public sector. We don't have good places to put people because poverty has a lot to do with the same reason a lot of people don't work. There's mental illness that we don't do anything about, because while corporate profits, for instance, are soaring, the highest ever on record, the share of our tax base coming from those corporations, the lowest on record. And this is all connected because it has to do with who we are, again, as a society. What do we do with people in poverty? So I think we have to do a lot to strengthen worker supports, but a lot of these other problems that we have are not going to be fixed by them. But we are absolutely, education's another one, and this is happening with the education system, with the many of our systems being privatized, right? Because people don't want to pay taxes, corporations don't want to pay taxes, and not only that, they want in on the tax base. Wherever there's a pot of public sector monies that we want to go to the poor or the uneducated or the mentally ill, boy, the private sector now is doing everything to get their hands on that money. I mean, the private is one of the worst experiments. Two of the worst experiments I can possibly think of were the privatization of the prison system and the privatization now of our K through 12 and our upper education. We're going to look back on this in 50 years or wonder what's going to be. It's like, when do you have inequalities, such as in educational outcomes and educational opportunities, and you think, yeah, let's privatize them, that'll make it better? Absolutely not. So we have to hit these on many, many issues, but one of the biggest issues we have is this idea that our tax rates are too high. The tax base, especially from corporations, is the lowest ever on record. We've simply shifted the tax base from very wealthy people and corporations to the backs of the broad middle class.
Well, that great progressive Richard Nixon He had a plan for a negative income tax
He
to
was
raise
progressive in
keep
some
the taxes relatively high on the wealthy, and that at a certain level, if people couldn't pay taxes, then the government paid them. I mean, it seemed like a very logical system to me. But anyway,
Yeah, we are the biggest, wealthiest economy in the world. We could certainly do so much more to bring up everybody from the bottom. I mean, just imagine shifting all of those, because really it's not the 1%. I mean, we're talking about the 1% because that's an easy narrative. It's really the point, you would know this, right? It's really the 0.01%. They've really are walking away with everything. And so imagine if you just distributed that better. All of our wealth, our great wealth that we have, over 20%, and it's much higher here in California, of our children living in abject poverty. We're not some developing country. We're there. We could do so much better, and we just don't, because again, the we, what's so important is who's the we, who has the power, the politics, and the policy working for them.
Hi, yes. Two words I like to hear when we talk about these things is economic justice. And all us wonky progressives, we know it's wrong. And the rich and the uber rich, they're the other side. But how in the heck are we going to wake them up?
wake up who? The super rich?
No, wake up the middle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wake up the middle, wake up the bottom. They're sleeping. And I haven't heard any how it could wake them up.
So what's the game plan, Chuck?
Well, I think, believe it or not, you may not notice it on your evening television, but people are waking up. I mean, the conversation about inequality is in a really different place. We as a country have a very high tolerance for inequality, and that's because we believe the myth of meritocracy and deservedness. But polls are showing that the reason people say, I don't really care how rich the rich are. As long as their wealth is earned fairly, the rules are fair, and we have social mobility, everybody has an opportunity. Guess what? Not everybody has an opportunity, and clearly the rules are now being rigged. And more people are waking up to that. That's why people now say inequality matters. Much more higher level. So I think there's an awakening. I think that there are social movements kind of knocking on the door, waiting. I think the underlying conditions are there, and I think it will probably be another economic bump in the road that ultimately kind of focuses people's attention. Meaning we haven't done well. I think that will. Yeah, I think there's going to be new swarms, new formations like Occupy, and I think that nothing has changed in terms of the underlying sort of speculative market machine. Debt is growing again, individual debt. Wall Street has not repented and is moving back into the sort of exotic financial instruments that brought the economy to the brink. Our job is, when that happens, to be in the streets and seizing the moment and pointing to different kinds of interventions. We're not going to bail out the banks. We're going to break up the banks next time. That should be the demand. Sort of articulate what is the program, and pain is what often wakes us up. Yeah.
But it's also
opportunity
what's happened
and
is
inspiration
an
too.
extension of the inequality and the blowing up of the housing bubble. People are desperately trying to hang on to the rungs of the economic ladder that they climbed, and they're slipping slowly, but and they're trying desperately to hang on to the lives that and many haven't, right? So how are they going to become politically active? That's part of inequality. You keep the working class especially just down and off of their game and unbalanced and constantly worrying about money and trying to keep your position, keeping your house. I mean, how can they, I think it's really, really hard because they don't have the power to even hold on in their own lives, let alone to be so active. I mean, I really believe that we have to somehow have a progressive movement from people in politics to, first of all, get the money out of politics. That's the only way you can change the power. And it's only then that you can see real change. I mean, you know, you have the Democrat, there's just not, there's just not enough daylight between the two parties right now. And we need progressives that are actually in there talking working class progressive policies, such as the dual mandate of the Fed, full employment. Because we don't have unions anymore, under 7% in the private sector, we need full employment. We cannot have, periods of like we've had now for 6 years of an extremely, degrading and weakened economy, and think that workers are going to get anywhere. So, we need to get the money out of politics. You need to have in the short term full employment. You need to let people who want to join unions, make it easy for them to join unions, strengthen the people that are in unions. Look at the Gap, right? You've heard about the Gap. I mean, the idea that they've come out now and said they're going to pay, they have 90,000 workers. They're going to pay anybody under $10. They're going to pay everybody at least $10. You know how many of those 90,000 workers are going to get a raise? 65,000. So the other thing that we can't always count on, but we may be now, because that's putting pressure, is maybe some people will just do the right thing even with missing policy like an active minimum wage. If you had the Gap come out to do this, you have Walmart now pressured to thinking about doing it. Look, I know we can't count on these guys to do the right thing, but it looks like there is a little bit of that happen right now. Every little bit counts. But in the end, it's really hard to rein in when you have no power, when a few people have all the power and the policies that they want. And again, we're in this kind of vicious circle.
Personal interest. As a university professor, I'd like to know if you have any hard facts and figures concerning the effects of income inequality on the university level of education. Like, is it true that a higher percentage now compared to 20 years ago of the student body come from wealthy families, things like that? Do you have any hardcore stuff I can go suck my colleagues with?
I was just reading about a new study that has shown this, and I'm sorry, I just kind of read it on the plane coming down here, that is showing that over time that that the children of are being the upper education are being more populated by the wealthy than before. It's always been the case, but it actually looks like it's growing worse. But there's a great study that's been around a while that I talk a lot about, because another outcome of inequality is we leave a lot of talent behind, and it's the case that when you look at kids who scored low, medium, and high on an 8th grade test, and then you also know if they're from a low, a medium, or high income family, and the rate that they get college degrees, at least a BA degree. When you take a very smart kid who comes from a low income family, and then a not so smart kid that comes from a high income family, they get BAs at about the same rate. But your question is, are those trends getting worse? And it looks like that is the case, because of course the explosion of especially higher education and the cost is leaving a lot of lower income kids out. But they actually, to look it up, you can probably Google it. They looked at a cohort from the 60s, early 60s, and then they looked at another cohort from the 80s to show this difference.
Just there's a book by Susan Betzler that just came out called Degrees of Inequality: How the Politics of Higher Education Sabotaged the American Dream. And it's looking at the fact that, so 3 out of 4 families in the top quintile go to college, 1 out of 10 in the bottom quintile go to college. And I just did an article in the American Prospect actually a couple months ago, but it's called The Politics of Inherited Advantage, which looks at all the 101 ways that families in the top 5th or the top 10% help their kids. And so higher education started off as elite, and then it became kind of a bulwark against privilege, and now it's reinforcing inequalities of privilege again. So that's the quick story, and I think Susan Metker, Degrees of Inequality, tells that story.
First of all, thank you very much for sharing your evening with us. And it's a really large question to end with, but we wanted to ask you to briefly comment on the implications of all of these trends on the future of gender-racial inequalities in this country.
I could speak more on the racial side of that, which is, that so we're telling the story about inequality, but there's another subtext or a parallel story about the racial wealth divide. So that, in the years after World War II, there were policies that primarily helped the expansion of the white middle class, what Ira Katznelson calls white affirmative action. So the GI Bill overrepresented in white communities, white returning veterans, all the programs that were about first-time home buyers, the VA, Farmers Home. So there were good policies, but they tended to essentially, because of the legacy of racism and the racism and the implementation of them, reinforced or widened inequalities. So the home ownership rate shot up for white households and stayed relatively low or slowly crept up for households of color. So I guess I would say that we should look at the racial wealth divide. Some of the interventions to fix these things are the same, and some of them are different. So I think we have to bring a uniquely racial lens to that. And I just a couple of resources on that. There's Tom Shapiro at Brandeis University does really interesting stuff on the hidden costs of being African American and the sort of the racial wealth divide and the asset building policies. Basically, one group of people were allowed to get on the asset building train and others were barred from getting on that train. And lo and behold, 50 years later, the racial wealth disparities are more extreme. And then they were obviously exacerbated by the economic meltdown, where households of color's primary ownership of asset was their home value and home. And so as home values evaporated, the racial wealth divide actually accelerated in the last 6 years. So that's one piece of the story.
Do you want to take on the gender aspect?
Well, just one thing on the race issue. I mean, I live in Oakland, California, and this idea, again, it's all interconnected. The corporatocracy, the privatization of prisons has done everything to dismantle and to that leads into this no wealth in in a lot of the black communities. It has everything to do with that people are making money off of criminalizing black men in places like Oakland, and it has to be reversed. This is something, again, this is such a blight on us as a nation. It's hard to overstate. Women, there's some good news on the front for women, right? If you go into college, women are kicking ass, right? The girls now are, but we do have still a lot of gender and race ceilings, obviously. We don't have enough women in power. We don't have enough women of color, men of color. They're not in the upper echelons of corporate America, is still white and male. The Forbes 400, there's very few people of color or women.
Except on television. There's always black presidents and,
right.
and
Yeah.
heads of various nefarious government organizations.
No, but again, it's as a society, to me, you're measured, and what do you do when you have these what I call what EPI calls inequalities at the starting gate? We have to be measured by what do we do if we have, because the truth is though for women, especially working class women, they are always the lowest paid. Almost a vast majority of minimum wage workers are women and women of color. One of my biggest issues that I've been working on, which we don't have this here in California, is the sub-minimum wage. So being from California, you might not know we're one of the only 7 states that don't have a sub-minimum wage. The sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, for like wait staff at the federal level, is $2.13 an hour, and has been so since 1991. So the other NRA,
National Restaurant
Association, is why, right? That was signed into perpetuity, frozen at 213 under President Clinton, right? Herman Cain was the president of the National Restaurant Association at that time. So the low wage issues, whether it's the sub-minimum wage or the minimum wage, is a story of overwhelmingly women, white women, women of color, poor, working class women, which is another thing hard to believe in the most wealthy, richest, largest economy in the world, that we have a very serious problem of the working poor.
One last statistic. The Forbes 400 this year, 400 wealthiest households, and their wealth is greatly underreported. have as much wealth as the entire African American population in the United States. That's a new trend. African American wealth going up, the concentration of wealth. So, and 2 resources. Inequality.org is the portal that I help edit, but we have a little weekly newsletter. So if you want to plug into the activism side of this, sign up for this little weekly newsletter we do called Too Much at inequality.org, and also join the other 98%, which started before the 99 to 1, but there's probably 500,000 people on Facebook and on the website connected to these campaigns on these issues of inequality.
Just speaking, one more statistic. Speaking of the Forbes, I love the Forbes 400. It's one of my favorite things to look at. You think Walmart can go pay their workers $10 an hour? The 6 Waltons, who didn't do anything but be born into the family, I mean, they're not the one who came up with this, right? The 6 Waltons on the Forbes 400 are worth more than $150 billion. That's incredible. $150 billion and probably underestimated.
Wealth
by
equal
quite
to
a
the
bit.
lower 40% of all Americans. That one family.
That's right.
Well, thank you both for joining us, and join me in thanking our guests.